I was torn about whether I should do this video on my backup second channel or whether I should put it on my main channel. Obviously, I've committed now to putting it on my backup. And it's one of those things where I'm fascinated at this concept, although I'm upset by it too. And it's one of those weird things, but in a broader category, it's this. When somebody publishes something that is wrong, nowadays it gets put out there into the internet, and it's out there in the universe now. It's floating around out there, tubes and wires and so on. And if it's wrong, well, it kind of joins a pantheon of things that are out there that are true, and eventually it kind of waters things down to where I assure you, today, I'm going to get messages from people going, Steve, did you see this? Did you see this? And I'm going to have to write them back and go, yeah, it's not true. It's not correct. And what's bothersome about it is it's in a field that I have written about and studied about, and it's annoying because I've spent years writing books trying to straighten out stories. And the best example I can give you is about whether the doors at the Italian Hall opened the wrong way. And I actually got a historical marker changed and got wording taken off and got to rewrite the wording that got put on. And that's because I basically did tons and tons of research trying to just get rid of one myth. But this is even stranger. So I'm yesterday poking around on the old internet, and something popped up on my news feed, and it's mlive.com. And mlive is a news source that focuses on news from Michigan. And it says, do you know where the name Michigan comes from? Michigan. Where does the name Michigan come from? What does the word Michigan mean? Hint, it's not a mitten. So a lot of people will tell you that Michigan's Lower Peninsula looks like a mitten. And if you ask somebody where they live in the Lower Peninsula, they'll often pull their hand out and they'll point. So you live at Mackinac City, it's up here. You live in Bad Axe, it's over here. You live in Detroit, it's down here, okay? It depends on exactly how your hand is shaped as to whether or not the maps are anatomically correct. However, where did the name Michigan come from? Interesting question. So I know the answer to that because I've written about it extensively. However, I'm interested always in when people talk about things I'm interested in, so I read it. And the author writes, the mitten, the Great Lake State, which is, of course, what we have on our license plates. Well, sometimes it says Pure Michigan or Michigan.org, but it used to say Great Lake State. The origin of the word Michigan is a nod to one of the state's most recognizable creatures. Absolutely not. That statement is false. It's false. It's incorrect. Now, interestingly, the author of this article then tries to explain where she got that from and why she thinks it's true. But she wanders off and goes, it's a Michigander tradition to hold up your hand as a map and let people know what thread of the big mitten you belong to. What thread of the big mitten? I've never heard anybody say, here's the thread I live in. I've always heard people say, I live here, I live here, I live here. I've never heard of anybody imagining the mitten unraveling down to the threads. But that's okay. She's trying to be creative. She says that distinct shape was referred to as Turtle Island by the people of North America, the locals. The head of the turtle is Michigan. So she's saying this looks like a turtle head to her, or at least it looks like that to the people who gave that name to it. And she says that distinct shape was referred to as Turtle Island. The head of the turtle is Michigan. Okay. I'm going to finish her version of the story and we'll get to the truth. When the settlers came, they asked what the indigenous people called different parts of the land, and they responded, Michigan, which means turtle. No, it doesn't. However, Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, which is over here, shared this history from a 2014 interview between an Ottawa representative and the National Park Service in celebration of Native American Heritage Month in November. Similarly, the Ottawa name for Mackinac Island is Michilimackinac, meaning big turtle, or also translated as Turtle Island. Now, that's a story I've heard quite a bit, so I'm not going to get into that now. Later, the French used their own version of the original pronunciation and named it Michilimackinac. The English shortened it to the present name Mackinac, according to Pure Michigan. Now, that's true. That is true. That whole thing about Michilimackinac, Mackinac, and so on. Fitting that in 1995, the painted turtle became Michigan's state reptile. The painted turtle was chosen as representative after a group of Niles fifth graders discovered that Michigan did not have a state reptile according to the state. And so let's get back now to where she says, Michigan is known by many names, but the origin of the word is a nod to one of the state's most recognizable creatures. The distinct shape of Michigan was referred to as Turtle Island, and the head of the turtle is Michigan. So you go, wait, Steve, hang on a second. Does she just write stuff and they publish it, or did they look it up? Or, well, she cites Pure Michigan. And there's a website called Pure Michigan. It's also one of the slogans of the state, but Pure Michigan is an organization. It's a state organization that promotes Michigan. And so they do write a lot of these travel-type pieces, and they wrote a piece called How Did Michigan Cities Get Their Names? Not how did Michigan get its name, how did Michigan cities get their names? And they wrote, each city in Michigan has a unique history and tradition. This includes everything from when the city was created to how it was named. See how a number of Michigan cities earn their names below. And so she cites this article and apparently got her information on where Mackinac Island got its name. And so in this piece, it says, like many historic places, Mackinac Island's name derives from a Native American language. It's been said that Native Americans thought the shape of the island resembled a turtle, so they named it Michilimackinac, meaning big turtle. Then the French used their own version of the original pronunciation and named it Michilimackinac. However, the English shortened it to the present name Mackinac. So that's how Mackinac Island, Mackinac Straits, Mackinac Bridge, that's where the word Mackinac comes from, not the word Michigan. And so how she took that gigantic leap from Michigan is known by many names, but the word Michigan is a nod to one of the state's most recognizable creatures. No, Mackinac is, or Michilimackinac, but that's not where the word or name Michigan came from. So now, I know many of you are probably saying, Steve, just because you say it's not true doesn't make it not true. Well, I'm going to start, though, by pointing out to you a book that I wrote that addresses this very topic. The book is called Michigan's Columbus, The Life of Douglas Houghton. And in here, on page 11, I write, and I admit I wrote this, when white men began arriving from the east to the area now known as Michigan, they asked the natives what they called the land. They said they called it Mississaugan, which meant lake country, not Turtlehead, lake country. By some counts, the state of Michigan is home to more than 11,000 inland lakes. Not only was the land rife with lakes, it was surrounded by the Great Lakes. And many sources say that the name Michigan was originally affiliated with that gigantic lake off of the west coast of Michigan, i.e. Lake Michigan, and that the state got its name from that. So the natives may have been saying, we call the area Michigan because of that big old lake. But they could have also been calling it lake country because of the number of lakes, okay? But again, when white men began arriving from the east to the area now known as Michigan, they asked the natives what they called the land. They said they called it Mississaugan. Now you might go, Steve, did you just make that up? No, it turns out that in the back of my books that I write that are nonfiction, which as of right now is all of them, I have notes sections, notes and sources. So if you want to know where I got that from, on page 150 I wrote, the origin of the name Michigan is from Landman, page 167. So there's an author whose book I cite repeatedly, who's a historian, and I got it there from page 167. But then I wrote, although it is a very common explanation, see also Wheeler, page 354, Michigan Pioneer and Historical Collections, number 32, 1902. So there's these books that are called the Michigan Pioneer and Historical Collections, where somebody went and rounded up all kinds of old articles about history in Michigan. And I was researching through those old articles, and I found one from 1902, that says, here's where the name Michigan came from. So I cited two sources there and said, this is a commonly told explanation, but here are the two sources that I'm going to point you to in case you want to question how authoritative my sources are. So again, I don't just put stuff in books and make it up. I give you citations and sources, and in fact, in front of this, I suspect, is So here is all the books in the bibliography and the articles and so on, and you can see there's quite a bit of stuff that I cover, but trust me, it's out there, okay? So that's this book giving that explanation, but also explaining its sources. So now, you might say, but Steve, come on, 2 or 3 sources, a couple of which you cite. Well, I challenge you to go on the internet and look at every single thing you find, except you will find now a link to her article saying it's because Michigan is shaped like a turtle's head. See, so I guess if you look at Michigan like this and turn it sideways, see, that's kind of like a turtle, I guess. I don't know. All I know is this. If you go on the internet and type in origin Michigan name, you'll find, for instance, the U.S. Department of the Interior, Indian Affairs, and remember, everyone agrees it comes from a native language spoken by people who were here when Europeans arrived. Origin of names of U.S. states. Michigan, from the Algonquin word Michigama, meaning big lake or great water, deriving its name from the lake of the same name, Lake Michigan, also said to be from Michi, meaning great, and Gama, meaning water. Michigama or Michigama, depending on how you want to hit those accents. So they say, that's what they think. Now, if you look at Wikipedia, and again, I understand Wikipedia is not a great source always, but you can check their sources. Wikipedia says the name derives from a Gallicized variant of the original Ojibwe word, Michigami, meaning large water or large lake. But where did they get that from? Well, they got that from the Library of Michigan, an article that the Michigan Library wrote, Michigan in Brief, information about the state of Michigan, Michigan facts, state name, Michigan's name origin, derived from the Indian word Michigama, meaning great or large lake. So you go, well, Steve, I don't know about that. Well, if you go to, by the way, if you go to an Ojibwe English online dictionary, it says Michigan in Ojibwe as Michigami, which gets you to the concept that Michigami is Michigan, right? Michigan.gov, a website put up by the state of Michigan. Facts about Michigan. State name, Michigan. Name origin, derived from the Indian word Michigama, meaning great or large lake. Now, you might say, but Steve, I've noticed that some say Michigama, Michigama, Michigami, Michigawan. Those are all different until you realize that if you were a foreigner and you set foot on soil that no one that you know had come before you, and you encountered a person who does not speak your language, and you asked them, where are we? If you got them to understand the question, and they gave you an answer because they understood the question, if they said, Michigama, Michigami, Michigan, those kinds of things, depending on how they speak, would not translate directly to you the exact same way they translate to somebody who came a week later and asked them the same question. And I can give you as an example of that. There's a place in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that's now called the Yellow Dog Plains, and a river runs through it called a Yellow Dog River. The Yellow Dog River runs through the Yellow Dog Plains. And I, doing research on one of my books, was curious as to where that name came from. And I went down a rabbit hole. And of course, no one's quite sure. But one of the stories that is told is that the first people who got there asked somebody, is there a name for this place? And they got no response they liked. So they decided to call it St. John's River in honor of the fact that it was either near St. John's Day or something, but they named it St. John's River. So they interacted enough with the locals to where they let the locals know we call this St. John. And somewhere along the line, some French speakers came along later and asked the locals, what do you call this place? And they go, we don't call it anything. It's nothing spectacular here. And they said, well, but the people who came before you called it St. John. Now, to someone who doesn't speak English, St. John and St. John sound alike. And French people hearing that thought it sounded like Shinjun. And I apologize to any French speakers in my audience, including JP, but the point is that Shinjun sounds a lot like it could be yellow dog with the adjective following the noun it describes. Shinjun, yellow dog. So then later, When other people came by and said, what is this place called? Somebody goes, well, the French call it Shenzhen. What's that mean? Yellow dog. Okay. And it just turns out that the first time it got recorded in writing on paper that lasted, somebody called it the Yellow Dog Plains and the Yellow Dog River. Is that story true? I'm not 100% certain on that. I'm willing to grant you that that right there has just enough stuff in it where it could be wrong, but it's plausible. But when you hear somebody say that it came from Michigama versus Michigama or Michigama, you understand that Michigami, these things are all very, very close. But every single source says, regardless of what the word is, it came from a native language meaning big lake. Now you might go, but Steve, what do you mean by native language? Because, well, that's the problem. They say it could be Ojibwa or Algonquin. And I am not a linguist, but I can tell you that there were stories of tribes and languages that were similar, and that many of these tribes could communicate with each other even if they spoke different languages. So not every language is so impossibly hard to understand by somebody who speaks another language. My understanding is that if you speak Spanish well, you can often communicate with somebody who speaks Portuguese. I don't know, but I've heard that. So elsewhere in Wikipedia, it says that Michigan is derived from the Ottawa, Michigami, meaning large water. And that's a reference to Lake Michigan. And of course, the Ottawa Michigami might be similar to the Algonquin Michigama. Maybe that's just enough of the difference from one language to the next. Meanwhile, and in case you thought I'd beaten this dead horse, I haven't finished. The state's Department of Natural Resources says that the DNR's website says that Michigama means large lake. It's derived from the Chippewa language, is applied to the entire Great Lakes region by Native Americans, and then by explorers who first traversed the Great Lakes in the 16th century. Over time, the early residents added more names and sorted out the local geography, but the name Michigan remained as a reference to the entire region and one of our Great Lakes. You might go, but Steve, wait, they just introduced a third language, Chippewa. Well, to those of you who don't know, Chippewa and Ojibwa and Ojibwe are closely related, and it also depends on who's speaking, because sometimes people would hear something and our ears don't pick up on the differences in another language. And finally, I'm going to end with an encyclopedia. Encyclopedia Britannica says the state's name is derived from Michigama and Ojibwa, and then they put in parenthetical Chippewa, word meaning large lake. Probably a reference to a specific large lake, i.e. Lake Michigan. And of course, I'm pointing in the wrong direction because it's actually that way. So the point is that there's an article on MLive that went up last night saying that the name Michigan came from the anatomy of a turtle. It did not. It came from a place name describing a very, very large lake, quite probably Lake Michigan, although some people, even in the early days, thought it was a reference to many lakes. And the question, of course, is would people speaking to natives back then get the distinction between large and many? Because things that actually describe those kinds of things might be similar depending on who you speak to. But there you go. That's where the name Michigan actually came from. And I'm now don't know what to do because I know that article's going to be out there. It'll live forever. And I know some people are going to say, Steve, why don't you contact them and see if they'll fix it? Number one, it involves a certain amount of hubris to contact somebody and go, I'm right, you're wrong, change that. But number two, I've had very bad luck doing that. I've contacted people before. I've contacted people who misquoted me and said, you misquoted me. And they're like, well, it's already in print. I've seen people, I've seen websites actually make corrections and go, an earlier version of the article said this, but we needed to correct it. Yeah, we don't do that. And I don't want to get too heavily into the ones that I've pointed out because some of them are ridiculous. But I will tell you that I was once quoted by a little local newspaper about a talk I was about to give about the Italian hull disaster. And somebody in the interview asked me, how many people died? And I said 73. And we were talking on the phone. And she goes, excuse me? I go 73. I go, just more than 6 dozen. 6 dozen. And she goes, oh, wow. And the article came out and it said, according to Lehto, 6,000 people died at the Italian hull. 73. 6,000. Wouldn't you ask and go, excuse me, I misheard you. I thought you said 73, then you said 6,000. I said more than 6 dozen. Okay. Now I understand I do occasionally talk fast, but it's amazing. But like I said, unfortunately, once it works its way into print, even on the internet, it'll be there forever. So I'm hoping, if nothing else, that this video will counteract that article, because I think a lot of people are going to read it and go, wait, I've never heard this before. And then if they do look at her source and they go, she's misreading her source. So there you go. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later.